Yeah. Gundolf is, for those of you who don't know, most of you is in the US right now. So it's what, 9 hours difference or
9 hours.
9 hours? Yeah.
No, no, actually not. You're in the
Eight.
UK.
With Germany, it's 9. Yeah.
It's eight.
So 8 at the
It's
moment.
eight. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's eight.
Gotcha. Yeah. All right. Seems like we're good to go. So I have the great pleasure to present our final keynote, our closing keynote today in this quite successful game studies day, I think, so far, in terms of content and in terms of turnout, audience, everything. And entitled Emerging Life at and in the Virtual Frontier by none other than Gundolf Freyermuth, one of our directors, from whom you've already heard a little bit when I introduced the Cologne Game Lab at the very beginning. But just a few words about him before I give him the floor. He is a professor of media and game studies and founding director of the Cologne Game Lab at the Technical University of Cologne in Germany. He's currently in sabbatical, and I'm substituting for him. That's my role at CGL right now, to basically play the role of Gundolf while he's gone. And he also serves as an associate professor of comparative media studies at the International Film School in Cologne. And beyond academia, he has extensive experience as an editor, reporter, scriptwriter, and documentary filmmaker. Very varied career, very prolific as well. In the last decade, he has secured and executed numerous third-party funded research projects with combined budgets in the 7-figure euro range. So TH Köln is very thankful for that. Recently, he was awarded an Opus Magnum grant, the reason why he's on sabbatical, from the Volkswagen Foundation to complete his monograph, Play, Audiovisuality in the Modern Era, Theater, Film, Television, Games. His talk, if I'm not mistaken, will be based at least roughly on that research project. He also co-edits the Studies of Digital Media Culture series with Transcript Publishing, a German academic publishing house. And he has authored or co-edited over 20 fiction and non-fiction books and published approximately 500 papers, essays, and reportages. So a very prolific career, very hard to keep up with his work and to read everything he's written. But we're going to get, I think, a very good taste of what his mind has to offer and what his work is about with this keynote. So without further ado, Gundolf, the floor is yours. So yeah, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Thank you very much, Federico, for the kind introduction. I'm pretty sure they don't want me back. They want to keep you. I'm pretty sure. But it's not a threat, but it's a fact. I will be back in September. So thank you very much for having me. My talk will be about visions of future media, liminal media that is partly here, at least it is desired by some. We have conceived of it, and it's partly not here, but it may be here in the future. But first, I kind of want to apologize. As the last speaker, you should respond to the presentations that were given previously, and you should keep short what has already been discussed. But neither form of academic courtesy is possible for me, unfortunately, because I've been fast asleep here in the American West when you had your, I'm sure, wonderful talks. So please bear with me. I mean, I'm talking without knowing what has been said before me. Yeah, I'm here actually in the American West to finish my monograph. And indeed, as Federico said, future media plays an important part in this endeavor. And just to give you a preview of what we will be mainly talking about today, these three future media conceptions, utopia, whatever you want to call it, that came into this world within a few years, actually within a decade, between 1982 and 1992. And if you know, I mean, I'm just writing a book. If you know how long it takes to write a book, though Burning Chrome was a short story, but still it takes some time. The Snow Crash was a book. It basically all happened in the 80s, even though Snow Crash was published in 92. It all happened in the 80s, and we will be talking about why this happened and what are the specifics and the interrelatedness. What is the interrelatedness of these three? Pardon me, it's very early in the morning. I'm on my first tea. Sorry. The three future media, how they relate to each other, and to what questions kind of they were answering. That brings me to one preliminary remark that I want to make about game studies, because this, after all, is a game studies summit, whatever, event. Game studies are a young discipline, relatively, in comparison to literary studies or even film studies. Maybe a quarter of a century old, and I'm old enough to have been around when game studies, started, so to speak, when they were founded, when they evolved. And the first phase of the discipline typically has to do with defining the discipline. That means drawing borders, boundaries, setting limits, so that we were concentrating on the special nature of digital games and the independence of a discipline that deals with them. And I think the famous or infamous debate on narratology and ludology, which we all know never happened, was an important part of that process. And I think we largely have succeeded. And I think we are getting into a second phase now, or at least it's imminent, where we are moving from the specificity of digital games, because that has been established, to them as part of a cultural continuum. Both in terms of the cultural history and the present, transmedia production. And I think game studies must respond to this. And this is what actually my research and the book I'm writing right now is about. It's about finding out in which tradition games are evolving. And I think these are the common denominator with other media is audiovisual play. That's a common element, and I will be talking about that, because these three media, future media, non-existent media, utopian media, cyberspace, holodeck, and metaverse, are all in some way or the other about play and audiovisual play. In case of cyberspace, it's hallucinatory. It's happening in our head, but it's still audiovisual. So I think what we have to do now in game studies is we have to open up. After we have defined our borders, we have to go back to these borders and see what games have in common and how they are different from the older forms of audiovisual play. So my talk will have 5 parts. I try to be quick. First, I will talk about audiovisual play and the tradition in which digital games are positioned. And then I will talk about cyberspace, and you see the subtitle, Global Mind. This responds to the second future media, non-existent media, that's a holodeck, which is about local matter. And of course, in both cases, both has to do with virtualization. It could be virtual global mind, obviously in difference, in contradistinction to the global village, which obviously was not virtual. It was in the analog world. So virtual global mind, virtual local matter, and then the metaverse, which kind of combines it, the global mind over matter. And the last chapter will be about the virtual frontier, about life, not only in a medium, but as a medium. Okay, let's start with audiovisual play. I think if you look at the history of audiovisual play, the modern history, I'm concentrating on the modern history, the modern Western history since the Renaissance, we can see that there is a commonality between these forms. We will talk about them, but theater, cinema, television, software, what they have in common is a dialectical interplay of 2 elements, the narrative and representational elements on one side, and the mechanical and ludic elements on the other side. And that is, I think, one of the great opportunities that we have if you look at the history of audiovisual play from a perspective of game studies, because now we can see that what defines games, this interplay between ludic and the narrative, is of course it also defines as a constitutive element of theater, of the cinema, and of television. Think of particularly, I mean, the affordances that these different media have to manipulate space and time. In theater, the mechanical, I mean, is clearly visible. I don't have to explain much about that. So I think that is the big chance we have if you look from the perspective of game studies onto the older media. But we have to realize that actually the people who started to deal with games from a cultural perspective in the 20th century, I mean, you see here John Huizinga, Homo Ludens, 1938. These people, of course, they dealt with analog games because there were no digital games, right? But they realized that. They realized that actually a little bit more clearly than we in game studies did in the last 20 years. They realized that audiovisual play is a common element, a constitutive element. And here I give you the basic definition by Huizinga of play. And he says there are two elements. I'm not going to read it to you. I mean, you can read. I hope it's large enough. I don't know how large your screen is. So I don't know whether you can read it, but still, he says there are two. Now you're going to make it larger, Federico? Okay. So what Huizinga told us is that there are two elements that define play, and one is contest, competition, and that of course is based on rules. That's based on mechanics, and the other is representation, he said, and that of course is the audiovisual play, the narrative element. So and then of course he goes on and he defines it's a little bit distracting staring at your faces, and I mean, can I help you somehow, Philip? Yeah, can you somehow make? Yeah, it's on your end. It depends on the size of your screen and how far your projector is away from it. I mean, it's a time question. I can read part of it, but that takes me another 10 minutes. No, absolutely no problem. I will not fully read it, but I will talk a little bit more about what is written on there. Yeah. So what Huizinga then goes on, and he defines this famous element, the magic circle within there. But as part of the, he names the stage and the screen as places that are temporary worlds within the ordinary world. Liminal places, of course, or what later Michel Foucault called heterotopic places. So here we have, I mean, stage plays are not games, but they're plays. That's the point. We have this common element of audiovisual play, which is defined by these two parts: the ludic, the mechanical on one side, the contest, and the narrative, the representation on the other side. And then if you go on to the next classic, the second one, I don't have more. Of course, Roger Calois, he as well says that one of his four categories of play is simulation, as he says, or mimicry. So mimesis, audiovisual representation, audiovisual play, and he explains that a little bit. And he says that the act of imitation of play, they start in childhood, but they cross the border between childhood and adulthood. And theatrical presentations and dramatic interpretations are a constitutive element of play. That's the important part that we have to keep in mind. So they are not games, but they are plays. We're talking about play, playful audiovisual representations. And today we have 4 major groups. And that is a stage, of course, it's the cinema, it's television, and it's software. I'm not speaking about games because I think it's pretty clear that the medium is software. And within that medium, we have different genres or super genres, as Christian Metz would have said. And we can see that, for example, cinema by now is software as well. So games, so we have cinema, television, and games as 3 now super genres within the realm of software. Then we have other software, of course. And that's important because the 3 future media I want to talk about today, cyberspace, Holodeck, and the Metaverse, are all software-based, of course. They're all software-based, even if they project matter. Holodeck, don't talk about that. But they're computer-controlled. They're software-based. Okay, so what we have here, what we can see right away, we can see 2 things. One thing is the heterotopic experiences, the heterotopic places are moving from the public sphere to the private sphere. We have the stage and the cinema as semi-public places, and then we have the same heterotopic experience provided when we see these 2 kids in front of the screen. They are at home, but they're not really at home anymore. They're in a different world. They're in a typical threshold situation. Their body is at home, but their mind is somewhere else. So that's one process. The heterotopic experiences are moving from the public sphere into the private sphere. And the second thing that is important for the future media is the fact that these audiovisual media are based on different technologies. Originally, they later adopted the newer technology. Doesn't matter. But the thing is, the stage, the modern stage in early modernity was created with mechanical technology, and that, of course, defined the mechanics very much. I mean, what they could do, how people could enter and leave, and they couldn't cut like in cinema and stuff like that, or they could rarely cut with a curtain. So, and then we have, of course, the cinema, which is based on industrial technology, the electric phase, so to speak. And then we have television, which is also based on industrial technology, but in the electronic phase, the analog electronic phase. And then we have digital, and that changes everything. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But let me say one important element. Often people misunderstand when you point to the technology. Audiovisual storytelling and audiovisual play is not possible, except for street theater and so on. I mean, earlier forms. But these 4 forms are not possible without technology. Then often people think, oh, this is determinism, technological determinism. This is not what it's about. Well, I think if you look at Wilhelm Flasser once said, new technology is creating new imagination. And I see technology for audiovisual storytelling, audiovisual play, as foundational. You see, every house, every building needs a foundation. But on the same foundation, you can build a lot of different houses with different aesthetics, with different functions, and so on. So obviously, you can make a movie when the camera hasn't been invented, right? But then with that camera, you can make a lot of different movies, millions. So technology is foundational. And why I'm mentioning the technology here is because whenever a new technology emerges, we can see in modern times, I'm talking about the time since the Renaissance, we can see that then people imagine new media before it is there. And I want to give you, of course, for these 2 phases, the examples before I then come to cyberspace and co. We can see that the total work of art, this is the big fantasy, the big desire, the big future medium that people imagined for more than 150, 200 years, but mostly in the 19th century. And they hoped to overcome the limitations of the stage. That's what it was about. It was a utopian version that they aspired to create of the stage. Of course, Mr. Wagner, Richard Wagner, in the 19th century, kind of first wrote an interesting book about it, The Artwork of the Future, published in 1849. And then he tried to realize what he had envisioned, building on earlier visions. And what he wanted to create with the total work of art was a form of theater that, as he wrote, is an unconditioned, absolute portrait of perfected human nature. So what it was about was lifelikeness, as lifelike as possible. And then we see the same again in the 20th century with cinema. A lot of people thought in the 1930s, when sound and color were added to cinema, that it would be now a complete form of, or complete medium. They weren't talking about media then, they were talking about art forms, a complete art forms. But a lot of people didn't think so. And we have ideas of utopian forms of cinema that are multisensory. It starts, of course, with that was a dystopic vision, but I mean, we know the metaverse was a dystopic vision as well. So Aldous Huxley came up with the feelies. There were the movies first, and then there were the talkies since the early 30s. So he came up, the next step will be the feelies. Audiovisual play forms that you can not only hear, but feel. He thought that was a bad thing. But a lot of practitioners of filmmaking thought it was a great thing, and they tried to realize it in the 1950s, specifically when they had the competition, where they tried to fight off the competition of television. And then in the 1940s, actually, we have this very important film critic who became, who wrote the foundational text to create film studies. And he was talking about the myth of total cinema. He obviously was alluding to the total work of art with the term total cinema. And he said, again, it's about the same thing that Richard Wagner wanted to achieve on the stage. It's about a perfect illusion of the outside world in sound, color, and relief. Who does not think of the holodeck when they read it? And obviously, this is a description of the holodeck. Anyhow, the goal, again, is complete lifelikeness. And we have then a lot of other efforts. Think about Mort Heilig's Sensorama, or Walt Disney's theme park, which is also about a cartoon that immerses the audience, a multi-sensory experience created out of film narratives. And then we have expanded cinema in the 60s and so on. So we have a long line of future media that people come up with to overcome the limitations of existing media. And the interesting thing is, if you look at it, we can see that the dissatisfaction usually is expressed in a way that can be only fully satisfied with new media, not with the existing media. So what is a new medium? What characterizes the new medium that the software, the transmedium of software? And that, of course, is virtualization. There's a quote from Wikipedia. You don't have to read it. But the point is, we replace hardware by software. That's the main thing. When we speak about virtual server, when we speak about virtual drives, and so on. So hardware becomes software. That's the main point. And at that point, we can create new forms of media and new genres of audiovisual play. And that, of course, is the point in the 1940s and early 1950s, when the evolution of digital games begins. And I quickly go through this. I mean, we have the first phase, the procedural turn, when analog games are adapted, and we can call that the hyper-narrative turn, when text adventures are created. And actually, that's the point. Around 1980, when Cyberspace and shortly after Holodeck, these visions came up. You have to remember that digital games were not an audiovisual medium then. That's a very important part. Today, digital games are an audiovisual medium and they're competing with film and so on. But at that time, I mean, at the procedural turn, they had bulbs and punch cards that were giving the result of the game. And then we have screens with text. And that is exactly the point. No moving images when Cyberspace, Holodeck. And actually in 1992, we don't have so many moving images in games as well when the Metaverse comes up with. And then, of course, we go on in the evolution of digital games. We don't have to concern ourselves with that. And digital games become an audiovisual medium. And now they become a hyper-immersive medium. Anyhow, that's the point when these three future media, imaginary media, are conceived of. That's a pivotal moment. And if you look at social history, the history of technology, that, of course, is exactly the point when digital networking kind of comes out of the laboratory and starts to become something that is available for more and more regular people. So what we see here, that if you just look at them, and you all have heard about them before, the common denominator is that they envisage liminal and hybrid spaces for living virtually between fact and fiction. That's the important part that they all three have in common. They do that very different. They try to achieve that very differently, but it's all about envisioning liminal and hybrid spaces to be partly in reality and partly in virtuality, and virtuality is associated in these three visions with fiction. Okay, let's start with cyberspace. That's the first chapter. Gibson comes up with a term actually in the same year when Time magazine declares instead of the person of the year, the PC, the machine of the year. So it's exactly when digital technology, though not networking yet, 1 year later, the internet is created in 1983. So that's very few people had experience with computers. The ARPANET, which was the biggest network in 1982 when this came out, had 160,000 network computers, but they were not at home. They were in offices and in laboratories and universities and so on. There were very few games online and MUDs, and they were text-based, obviously. So that's the situation when there were no images in computing, simply put, in the early 1980s. The first computer with graphical user interface was also in like 1982, the Lisa, and then in 84, the Mac. But cyberspace is a text-based thing. And William Gibson now comes up with thought images. That's what the cyberspace is about. It's a global network that is based on hallucinations. That's the important part. So he said, you could say he could not imagine graphic computing and audiovisual global networking. So he said, basically, we jack into the matrix with a plug in our neck, and then our thoughts will communicate with the thoughts of millions of other people. There is this description 2 years later in Neuromancer. He conceived of the term cyberspace in this short story, and we actually have the history how he was doing that. And he first called it infospace, and then he called it data space, and then he settled on cyberspace in the end. And he defined it as a consensual hallucination of millions of people, operators around the planet. This became an extremely powerful concept in the 1990s. I give you here a part of John Perry Barlow, who was a songwriter for the Grateful Dead, but he's famous for being one of the two founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, very important until today, civil rights organization. And he wrote famously this Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. Everybody was talking about cyberspace in the 90s and not about the internet or the World Wide Web. And there's this beautiful sentence, governments of the industrial world, you very giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. So that's the practical application of the future vision that William Gibson had 96, and that was 82, so 14 years later. And full disclosure, I also wrote a book at that time, 1996, with the title Cyberland. I'm not saying anything more about it, but it's a lot about stuff that is very up to date. It's about transhumanism, it's about cryonics, it's about cyborgization, and so on. Okay, let's move on to the holodeck. The holodeck, interestingly enough, it's a vision that that's actually the very first time that the holodeck was introduced in 1987 in the first episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And Mr. Riker, for the first time, he's new on that ship and he discovers this strange place where you can simulate whatever you want to simulate. You can have a jungle on the spaceship, or you can meet detectives from the 1930s in a film noir, a holo novel, or whatever you want to do. So that is very much like Plato's cave. It's a windowless room on the spaceship, so it's local, it's not networked, and in there the computer can generate whatever you want. And that is multisensory. You can touch it, the water you can drink. Actually, when the malfunction is, and of course, most of the episodes are about malfunctions, then the bullet can actually kill you. So the whole concept is based on holography. And one person, Gene Dolgoff, very important inventor in the realm of holography, he talked to Roddenberry, and he had this idea that holography is based on light. Light in general is matter. So if he could base holography on a different form of matter, then we could read this to you. It's about meta holograms. Instead of light holograms, about matter holograms. We could record a hologram of the structure of matter and then reproduce the matter in the same way. And that science fiction, in the literal sense, a scientist who had an idea what we maybe could do at some certain point, then became science fiction. Roddenberry turned it into this idea of the hologram, of the holodeck. And this became a very important idea as well. I cannot go into that, but everybody tried to create a holodeck. And most famously, of course, the Lucky Palmer, the guy who came up as a teenager with the Oculus, in one of his first interviews, when they asked him, there's the Oculus. In one of the very first interviews, they asked him, what gave you this idea? And he said, I wanted to create a holodeck, but I couldn't create a room. So I wanted to create the illusion of a room. And that's what I did with my goggles. So this became like a guiding principle of media production in the American West, at least, for at least 2 decades. That's an important part of these. If you look back, the same is true for total film or the total work of art. These theoretical, futuristic ideas very often become guiding principles for practitioners who try to realize them then later on. Okay, let's move on to the very last, the metaverse. That's the one that I have to explain the least, because the concept has been hijacked by a lot of people who want to make money with it. But I'm talking about not Meta's metaverse, but I'm talking about Neal Stephenson's metaverse from 1992. So that comes again 5 years later by chance, and it's a network, persistent 3D world, basically a city street, 100 meters wide and 60 kilometers long. I think it's very much modeled after, not far from here, about 4.5 hours is the Las Vegas Strip. And I think he actually modeled it after the Las Vegas Strip. So the interesting thing is, of course, it's a network. The holodeck is local. The metaverse is networked, like the cyberspace, but it's not a hallucination. It's about 3D software created 3D worlds that you can inhabit in a way. That's the important part. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And very shortly after that, in 3 years later, Cybertown in 1995, I think you can see it up here, Cybertown, and then of course Second Life are efforts by people who read Stephenson, efforts to recreate that, or recreate the theoretical conception, create network worlds like that. Now, of course, as I mentioned, it's a commercial concept, has become a commercial concept. So the same thing happened. Like John Perry Barlow took the concept of cyberspace and founded the electronic client, so practical consequences. Or like Palmer wanted to create the holodeck. Now there are people who want to create the metaverse. And with the existing technology, so the definition I took this from Matthew Ball's book, The Metaverse and How It Will Revolutionize Everything. Of course, anybody who writes they will revolutionize everything are usually not revolutionizing anything. That it's based on today's technology, so a network, real-time rendered 3D worlds with continuity of data, with identity, history, and so on. I mean, you all know this. I think I'm a little bit over time, so I will not be able to play this. But that's we had a conference 2 years ago, and wonderful Janet Murray was talking about delusional technology. But I will skip over that. By the way, how much time do I have left? I don't know when we started. I was too tired. Nobody? Okay, I go on. Tell me if I should stop. So what we have here is we have a lot of contemporary efforts to build the metaverse. I think the future is dubious. They all remind me of America Online or CompuServe in the early 90s, proprietary concepts, walled gardens that all had to give way to the World Wide Web. And I think the same thing will happen here as well. I wanted to introduce this a little bit because Janet talked about delusional technology. The metaverse doesn't exist. I recently supervised the master thesis, Quantum Bar, where we, the two supervisors, spent hours in and definitely experienced something like the metaverse. So I think with all critique regarding the commercial efforts, there is something to it. And I actually miss the Quantum Bar once in a while when I put on my my goggles and play table tennis or something like that. Okay, let's move on to the last chapter. I want to I mean, I think even as a media historian, you should not just talk about the past. You should also talk a little bit about the present and the future. And so first, I want to sum up the relationship of these three future visions of digital media. And then I want to dare two postulates, how it's going on. Okay, so what we have, I talked already a little bit about it. We have in the concept of cyberspace, we have the immaterial. It's about a global virtual mind. And you can call this the thesis. And 5 years later, we have Gene Roddenberry's Holodeck, which is local and about matter, creating fictions that are multisensory chairs where you can sit in, so to speak, and not just look at. And that is about local virtual matter, because that matter is virtual. It's reorganized by the computer. And then, of course, you can call that the antithesis or the antithesis. And then, of course, Metaverse brings these two concepts together. That has a lot to do also with the progress in digital technology, that 3D world became imaginable. Global 3D world rendered in real time became imaginable. And then, of course, is a form of synthesis. And then there is a hybrid. It's a hybrid of local and global, and it's a hybrid of immaterial and material. So this comes together in the concept of metaverse, and that's, I think, is also why metaverse successfully as a concept superseded the older ones, cyberspace and holodeck. Okay, here I've put it into writing. The important part is, and that is the huge difference between the older concepts of the total work of art and the total film to a concept like the metaverse. Total work of art, total cinema, temporary experiences, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. Some theater plays are really long, but after a while, you get out. The idea of the metaverse is we should live in there, live in a medium. The metaverse is an alternative, not a heterotopic place where you go for a few hours. It's an alternative to the real world. You can stay there for days, so to speak. You can, that's the idea, you can make a living. You can work there as well. You cannot work in the total work of art or in total cinema. It's just recreational. But in the metaverse, you can live. And that's a very important part. And of course, we have not only Meta who's trying to do that, we have a lot of other Epic Games and so on. We have a lot of other efforts to create societies in media. And that's the new thing. The metaverse as a concept, and it starts with the holodeck. People, I mean, they have these malfunctions and they have to stay there they can't get out anymore. They have to live in there. And later they create actually the idea of a hologram that we can live in the holodeck and wants to get out, the Doctor in the later series. So this effort to overcome media as a concept for a temporary escape to a concept for longer, and in the end, permanent escape. That is a very new thing. And that's why one of my 3 postulates, they're getting close to the end. I think the first thing that we can see is in digital culture, media spaces become virtual. That's clear, that's virtualization. And through that, we can create inhabitable worlds and new ways of life. I mean, there's this great guy, Casanova, who deals with virtual economies. And he found out that already in 2005 or 6, the kingdom of Norath in EverQuest, if it had been a real country, it would have been number 130 on this planet, a GNP. So we are creating media spaces that function as inhabitable worlds, and a clear sign of that is their economic value, that you can make money in there and that they represent, that they basically have a gross national product that is comparable to a third of the countries on this planet. So that's a very important, pivotal shift, the medialization of the world we live in. And that was conceived of first in cyberspace and then in holodeck and then in the metaverse. And the second thing is a complementary move. I think not only the spaces we inhabit become media, we ourselves change into the same direction. After the discovery of DNA double helix in the early 50s, since then we know we are software or wetware, whatever you want. We have a code that can be programmed, and right now we try to reprogram it. So the thing is, we transform ourselves into a medium as well, a cyborgian hybrid of wet, hard, and software. And that is not science fiction. That's happening right now. CRISP is doing that. So it's not only the media that radically changes with digitalization. It becomes inhabitable. You don't want to live forever in the theater. But obviously, a lot of people like to spend half of their living time in certain games, right? Or in the metaverse eventually. That's a hope of Mr. Zuckerberg. So, but we also become more and more hybrids of real and fictional, or of born and written. And last but not least, the very last thing is that not only biological life, but also material reality medializes. The concept actually of of the holodeck, that a computer can create matter, is something that we try to transform into reality. Not only in science fiction, terraforming is a big thing, but nanotechnology is basically about that, the fusion of reality and a form of virtuality, in the sense that we try to manipulate matter by software. And 3D printing is a very simple, but it's a start. We create matter from software. We can basically beam a cup. I mean, I can take my cup, I can scan it, I can mail it to you, and you print it out on your 3D printer. So we are going into this direction of controlling not only our own media, our own biology, but also the material reality, controlling the material reality through software. So reality turns into a medium, a hybrid of hard and software. And that's the frontier we are living at. And that's a frontier that cyberspace, holodeck, and the metaverse, quarter century and longer ago, conceived of first. Thank you very much. I do.
Let's take a...
No, I didn't hear it. Wonderful. Thank you.
What questions do you have? Let's take a few minutes of Q&A. Let's see if we can pick Gundolf's brain a little bit. Yeah. Do you have a question? Can you move a little bit to the front because of the cable and tangling in the whole thing here?
Thank you for your presentation. I caught it halfway through, so I might have missed your point on this. But when I think about the points you're raising in terms of the mattering of technology or how technology materializes, I began to think, as you were talking about Freud, for example, so he also tried to conceptualize our space of unconsciousness or our dream space, right? So I just want to know where you draw the line that you're having a problem with in terms of, because looking at the speculative materialism or new materialism, speculative realism or new materialism, what they talk about, they try to see this materiality through everything. So in a way, they don't have problems where how our being is being materialized, but as opposed to in terms of how we engage with that material. So in a way, we've been, if you look at how language develops, works of Freud and so on, like you can go really far back and find the similar sort of traces that you've shown us here. I just want to know, where do you draw this line and where you sit in terms of the problem space you're seeing? Don't know if that's it.
Let's see if yes.
Where do I draw the line? Against what, so to speak? I didn't really fully understand. I don't really understand the question, actually. I can talk about Freud. I love to talk about Freud, but but I didn't really understand what line we're talking about.
Maybe you
the
want to
line
clarify.
Between the material and the immaterial, or?
So for me, based on what I caught in the last 10-15 minutes of your talk, you're talking about how we're changing, right? How we're changing in the sort of hybrid space of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that hybrid space of technology, for me, it existed for a lot longer than this. Yeah, it's true.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is now, why are we more concerned about this as opposed to seeing that sort of a richer, deeper material that runs through many different layers? I don't know if that's more clear.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting insights of Freud concerns exactly that, because and I think it's in the letter, he said, I mean, he started to think about the subconscious in the 1880s or so, and then somewhere in the 1890s, shortly before he finished the Traumdeutung in German, I just don't know the English title right now, the analysis of dreams, he went for the first time to the movies, and he wrote in that it completely changed his concept of the subconscious. So there was a new medium that suddenly explained something that he was thinking about for 2 decades. explained it to him better than he could have done before. The new medium changed, based on the new technology, changed his view of our humanity. And I think that's a very important part. There's a certain dialectical process between our technologies and us. First, I mean, I forgot which architect. Some architect said first we build buildings. So we changed the building. What we built new buildings, and then the new buildings are changing us. And that is exactly the same thing that Freud realized with technology. We create technologies, but then the technologies do two things. They first change the way we look at ourselves. We can see that how humans conceive themselves is very much based on technology. Mechanical technology basically changed our view, and we started to think of us as mechanical beings. We started to think of the heart not as the center of the soul, but of a mechanical pump, like we had just invented it. Suddenly we realized the heart is also a pump, and so on. So we can see how technology changes how we think of ourselves. And most recently, the last 20, 30 years, the comparison between the human brain and the computer, I mean, it's a constant element. So that's one thing. The view of ourselves changes with technology, and specifically with new media. Theater changed our way of thinking of ourselves. The movies changed the way we think of ourselves, how we conceive of ourselves. But then these new technologies and this new media, and the second step, they also actually change us. They change our perception. They change how we look at the world. Our worldview is changed by the media. We see the world through media, and so the world changes, so to speak. Their analysis of letters, for example. People described the world differently before they had seen movies, before they had grown up with movies, let's put it like that. We get a cinematic view of the world, of a great landscape, of a cityscape, whatever. We perceive it, so to speak. Our eyes start to learn from the cameras, and then we start to see like that, and so on. So I think there is a certain hybridity. You're absolutely right in your question. This has always been the case. Technology has always changed our view of ourselves and has created new humans. But the big difference between all that before, and I tried to show that very early in the slide between when I had stage, cinema, television, and software. The new thing is, the moment we move from the analog to the digital, there is a rupture. There is a radical difference. And one of the consequences is the one that you can still see on if the slide is still on. One of the consequences, we can go from heterotopic places that we, for entertainment or enlightenment, the church or whatever, or stupidity, I don't know. I shouldn't have connected the church with enlightenment. But anyhow, where we go for a certain time, the escape from the real world is only temporary in the analog world. As long as theme parks are analog, churches, cinemas, theaters, all analog. The moment we switch to virtual, this completely changes. We can now start to inhabit this world. These become habited. And the same, of course, is true with reality and our bodies. As long as we have only analog technology, yes, we can cut ourselves open. We can build a mechanical pump and replace a heart, but it's a little primitive, right? Painfully primitive. But that completely changes the moment we can manipulate our genetic information. And the same is, of course, yes, we can destroy nature by building a lot of highways, freeways. We've done that. We have done a great job at doing that. But terraforming would be something different, right? That would be something completely different. Of course, 3D printing goes into that direction already. So virtualization, the replacement of hardware through software, that is a categorical difference that changes, again, but more than ever before, the view of ourselves and how we can deal actually with our own biology and mortality.
All right. I would have one little question, if I may, before we end it. But because as you were going through the history of the audiovisual media, I was thinking, well, there's also, with the evolution of medium taking more of our perceptual apparatus, there's also an evolution of the fourth wall in some sense. With theater, is very much clearly there with cinema, but as media evolve, there's sort of an arms race to see who can fool our mind the most, to a point where the fourth wall becomes almost like an ontological construct or an epistemic construct, like abstract. It's like distinguishing what's real and what's not, and it becomes a lot more difficult, as you're saying, as software and medium start also impinging on reality and shaping it. I was wondering if you just have some thoughts on that, because we see this also, I think, all the time through media, how they shape our reality, our perception of reality. But the architects start also shaping reality, the material reality itself as well. I don't know what happens to this fourth wall in a way, and to our distinction between what's a medium, what's reality, or is it completely gone, or and what are the risks in that? In a way, I guess I'm getting at.
Yeah. I mean, what we can see is whenever rules have been established, or walls or borders, people try to climb over the walls, try to break through the fourth wall in this case. So I think if you look at media history, specifically in the 20th and 21st century, we can see there were, long before virtualization, there were efforts to overcome the mechanics, the rules of media. So things like living theater in the 60s, for example. I mean, it started with Bertolt Brecht and the epic theater. This was all an effort, the alienation effect, and no curtain and stuff like that, do away with the illusion. So we have a long history of efforts to get the actors amongst the audiences, and the audiences get the audiences on stage. Purple Rose of Cairo, Woody Allen, early 80s, when the character steps from the silver screen into the cinema and addresses the audiences. And so there's a long way to a long history to try to overcome and bring us the effect that now the players, the users, or whatever, that we are part of the action, so to speak. With regard to the other element, what is reality and what is fiction, the same thing. The moment, in the beginning, famously, the movies, like the theater, didn't know the difference between fact and fiction. They didn't know the difference between a feature film and a documentary. That's why they didn't have a problem when the assassination of President McKinley, in the early 20th century, there was no camera, nobody had filmed the assassination, so they hired an actor and shot it in the movie theater and sold it as a real assassination, because that's what you do on theater. And only in the 1920s, the concept of documentary, actually the term of documentary, was coined in Great Britain by Grierson in 1926, the documentary. And suddenly we had this separation. This was fiction, and this is a movie about the assassination of the president, and this is a documentary image or shot of shot. I shouldn't have said with assassination, but anyhow, footage of the assassination. And the moment they did this, people said, "Okay, now we can play with it." And they did something like People on Sunday in Berlin, up to whatever we have now as mockumentaries or so. So the moment you have a border, people will try to overcome it. The borders are established. They have to be established. Now we know that a documentary is different from a feature film. But the moment you do this, Citizen Kane, one of the greatest movies, 1941, it starts with a 10-minute fake documentary that actually Orson Welles had let the real documentary department of the studio make about this imaginary person, Citizen Kane. So I think this is not a new thing. It becomes a little bit harder to detect with digital technology. We can now fake much better, but we always try to fake for aesthetic reasons or for political reasons or for financial reasons. This is the difference is in that respect, I think, only in degree. It's not categorical. Art always tried, the moment when genres and boundaries had been established, somebody tried to overcome them, to subvert them, to undermine them.
All right, thank you very much. I think those are great closing words also for an event on this boundary, this liminality between reality and make-believe. Thank you very much, Gundolf, for a very thought-provoking and informative presentation. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and let's give him a hand again. And
thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure. Oh, an early morning pleasure.
And well, I hope to see you soon on this side of the pond, hopefully, or no, well, see you probably next on that side of the pond.
You have to come to the ranch first.
All right. Now we have to close for today. We have to also leave the room. So thanks very much, and see you soon, Gundolf. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
And everyone,
have a nice evening.
Thank you. Again, thank you, everyone, for attending, for staying until the end. Join the Discord, scan the QR code. Sorry? Oh, yeah, sorry. What do I have to do with the camera? Yeah, hello, I'm here. Yes, I didn't realize I was outside of the frame. Yes, because I wasn't paying attention. But join the Discord. Everyone online also, thank you very much for joining and for sticking around. I had a lot of fun. I'm very tired now, so I really need a beer and then some sleep. So, well, good evening to everyone. And, yeah, see you around, hopefully. All right?